Hey everybody, this is Dr. Martin. This is just a quick video to review and introduce Iris Marion Young for those that were not able to read it or on chapter 2 from Justice and the Politics of Difference. And in this opening chapter, in this video, I want to set out 5 points that she makes that distinguish her thinking from the theories of justice that we looked at. Real quickly, she was a political philosopher, a feminist, and an activist at the University of Chicago. Being both a feminist and activist impacted her critique of the traditional forms, theories of justice, and the formulation of her own theory of justice on social justice. I don't want to review this, but the assumption is you've listened to or read the case of Sandy, and that case raises this fundamental question for what happens to Sandy as to who's at fault. And her position is ultimately that nobody's really individual is at fault. It's really these systems, right? And these structures within the systems. And that if we want to look at social justice, we oftentimes have to look at groups that are on the margin that are impacted by that, but also the systems and structures that advantage some and disadvantage others. This is a diagram I may refer to, but instead of looking at power as this hierarchy, I think it's better to look at it as this kind of a circle, in that there are groups and theories that are at the center of power that make sense for those people that are there, and they might be quite reasonable, but don't fit the experiences or help explain or facilitate or enable justice for those on the margin, like all of those listed on the outside here. So what is her argument in this introduction? Number one, she's in search of, as I just said, an understanding of justice, or a form of justice that enables those social groups that are on the margin. She critiques these other theories of justice for really being too individualistic in their perspective. And that at the heart of it, that's part of the problem, she says, right? Because the assumption is these are individuals operating on their own, and if you could just reasonably work out these sort of certain circumstances, one should do better. But she's saying there's many other factors besides just monetary or distributionist forms of reallocating money or contracts or something like that that will help facilitate justice, right? And we're going to kind of look at these 5 faces of oppression she talks about, and that each of those look at different parts of things that, if we resolve, can help enable justice. But the big thing is, she wants to say a lot of times groups that are on the margin, these social groups that were listed like previously, they don't have a sense of identity where they're an individual, and out of an individual they operate in life and they become a part of social groups. Rather, a lot of times they have their identity first as a social group. They are all part of a community, right? And there's assumptions and values embedded within that community, right? And it's out of that that they then operate as individuals. And then she says, because we conceive the individual and the social wrong, that has to be revisited because there's assumptions made on that. Number 3, kind of what I referred to earlier with Sandy, she wants to maintain that it's not individuals that do the oppressing, right? Individuals might benefit. If you're at the center of power, you benefit by systems favoring you, like really good schools and really good neighborhoods, good jobs, good families, the 5 Gs for those that read that article of the New American Aristocracy. But if you don't have those, you are disadvantaged, right? So it's not people at the center of power, some puppet master that's like, oh, we don't like these people, so therefore we're going to go. It's more like the people at the center of power who are making rules and laws and policy based on their own rational assumptions about what works, right? But that's the whole point. They're individuals. It's individualistic orientation that, and also it's not from the experiences of being on the margin, and that those experiences on the margin, if they're included in decision making about rules and laws, it would be very different. So again, injustice done by individuals, but by structures and systems on individuals. Okay, point 4. Okay, why are groups on the margin? Well, she says there's 2 reasons why they're on the margin. One is they're perceived by those in the dominant group in the middle as being different. How are they different? Well, maybe that's a different gender, it's a different color of skin, it's a different body type, it's a different sexuality, all of, maybe it's a different religion, all of those sort of differences, right? So if they come from these groups, they walk into the dominant, they begin to experience themselves as different, and that the normative rules and values within that dominant society don't speak to their own experiences. So in some ways, they are marginalized by the dominant value sets and then the systems that are set up around those value sets. And so they're kind of forced there on the margin, and they might find identity with the group that they come from. They could come from an ethnic group or an immigrant group or a refugee group where that sense of family and culture, sometimes religions, all of those give, value sets and sensibilities there. But sometimes they're forced there because there's nowhere else they can find that they belong. So, for instance, the case of LGBTQ youth today in America, they frequently have the highest suicide ideation rate of any group in high schools because they don't feel like they belong, that their normative sense of self is not recognized within the center of power. So they find one another and hopefully they find good people that include them, right, and who they are. But one other group that oftentimes today in 2023 and 24 is on the margin are immigrant groups, people that are undocumented immigrants and refugees in our own society. They probably, as is argued in some of the articles we read this year, are the most exploited of all groups because they don't have any legal status. So they're forced there, but also when they're there, they forge their own identity, and that kind of flows into the 5th point that she makes. That she says it's really important that these groups strive to redefine their identities, not based on the dominant group's view of them, which oftentimes are called stereotypes. And again, I want to say, talking about groups demographically and all of that, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But when it's done outside of the groups themselves, oftentimes it's wrong. And if it's done from groups that think these others, right, are very different than them, right, sometimes it's done in a really unfair way, right, in a very detrimental way to the identity of those groups that are on the margin. And that's what stereotypes are. Stereotypes are efforts made to talk about other people, right, without really knowing those other people. And sometimes it's done in a very biased way, right, and it's done in a very detrimental, caustic way towards those other groups that are on the margin. So it's really important that those groups on the margin deconstruct how they're talked about by these the mainstream society normative groups, but also define for themselves their own values, define for their own selves the attributes that they find most important. And if we are in the middle, we strive to help facilitate that. So those are the 5 points that she makes in those introduction I find is really important. These are the 5 faces of oppression: exploitation, powerlessness, and marginalization. Those are the first 3, and she writes about those through the lens of sort of labor, the sort of class conflict around labor, both capitalists who own and labor who brings their skills, right, and the negotiation about the value of work itself. Also talks about gender in each of those, and gender, oftentimes women's work, which can be really important for families, right, and for nurturing community and nurturing children, oftentimes is undervalued or even ignored as a contribution because of our capitalistic society, we overvalue things that add benefits things that lead to more capital or money, right? So undervaluing those things that are really, really critical to community and family, and overvaluing the kind of work that contributes towards money or capital. And marginalization oftentimes has to do with autonomy and decision making. The closer you are to decisions made about your work or your life, the less marginalized you feel. But if you have no impact, or you don't feel like what you have to say matters, right, in your family or in your community, or certainly your work or your place in society, so can't make a big difference from that, then you feel marginalized. The other two are interesting too: cultural imperialism and this notion of double consciousness there. And that is where groups that are on the margin have to grapple with this, how they're perceived, right? And labeled and categorized by those in the dominant mainstream, right? About them, right? And they have to grapple with that and almost deconstruct that. Do they believe in that, or they have to really um, own up to their own sense of who they are, right? And so they have this double consciousness of how the dominant folks are thinking about them, but also who are they and how their community thinks about them, and where do they arrive with that. The other is violence. And if you are marginalized and powerless and exploited, it's very easy to be victims of violence in society. And that has to do everything from, the laws that are set up against you, um, the police, right? Um, Groups that are in the middle that don't like you and want to target you for one reason or another, and that you feel that you oftentimes um, and can't represent yourself. And again, we can think about this as far as labor, gender, and race. Okay, that's it. We'll continue to talk about more of this, but I wanted to make this video for those that missed it, as well as a review for those, as this is a very difficult kind of first part of the reading.